Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Rondi, Robison, and creator of Mending the Self Video Summit. This summit is for anyone experiencing grief and loss, or maybe you know somebody who is going through these difficult times. I have the pleasure of talking with a number of experts throughout this journey about different ways to experience grief and loss, and how we might be able to heal throughout this process and create and cultivate joy and resilience within our life. Have you ever wondered if men and women experience grief or emotions differently? I know that I have, and I spent a lot of time actually researching the differences between men and women when going through different difficult times, traumatic losses. And today I am thrilled and super excited to have with us Glenn Kelly. He's a public speaker and award-winning author of several bereavement support books, including Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, Grief Case, Grief Healings 365, which are daily motivations during times of grief to move forward through that process. He also does workshops with grief in the workplace. And he came to his work as he unexpectedly lost his teenage son, an only child to a congenital heart defect. Today, he's an authority on male versus female expressions of grief, citing the impacts of nature and nurture on each sex. Ron brings awareness to how our pre-wired differences, which seem opposing at first, will actually lead to long-term support throughout the healing process of loss. So Ron, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled.
Well, Ron, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this work and what drew you to questioning the difference between men and women?
Well, certainly. I had, as you said in the bio introduction there, I had lost my son, Jonathan. He was 16 and a half years old, a wonderful boy. He was born with a congenital heart defect, and he wasn't really supposed to pass away. I mean, it was sudden, it was unexpected, just as any other passing had done. But I was, before we even started talking here in the recording, we had talked somewhat about my past. I was rather egotistical because of my background. I'd been a police officer and a federal agent and sort of lived around my ego. And once I went through the trauma of losing my son, I didn't grieve him for some time. It was not in my ego set to really grieve the loss of my son because I had too much going on. I had 1,200 employees at work. I had I was a boss. I was a big guy. I had other people that I had to take care of. And I said, well, you know what? I'll get by. I'll be fine. And that lasted for about 6 months. Entitled the first book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. I tell people it was after the 6 months that John came to me in the shower. And whether people believe that he moved through me or not, he said, how dare you? It wasn't spoken words. He said, how dare you not grieve me? From that point forward, I realized that I had to grieve him and wanted to know, number one, why I couldn't. And there were a number of questions that I had that I thought maybe since my ego told me, and I'd like to default this by if somebody needs to go seek counseling, please go seek counseling. But my ego told me that I wasn't going to lay on anybody's couch and pour out my gut to them. So I'll do like any guy did. I'd at least turn to a manual if I couldn't figure something out. So I went looking for books to read on male grief. And I found none. I found a couple. Some of them just didn't seem to resonate with me, but there wasn't that broad amount that we find in other topics, such as women who grieve and siblings who grieve, and not to make fun of it, even grieving the loss of a pet. But there wasn't anything specifically out there for men. So by default, I had to dive back into really trying to figure out the differences in the way that males and females express emotions differently. And that was a lot of research and a lot of white papers and a lot of just getting down into the nitty gritty. And in doing so, I came up with some wonderful aha moments, just things that made me realize, number one, I'm okay. And I talk about that quite a bit in my books, is that I'm never trying to tell anyone how to change. This isn't about change. This is about understanding that you're okay unless you're harming yourself. As I alluded to earlier, you're not taking care of your hygiene, or you're finding recreational drugs to be quite fun, or you're a little bit more in the bottle. None of this is about saying that you need to change who you are. It's about understanding who you are and having the awareness of why you are the way that you are. That then expounded since, and no offense to the ladies, but since I had to understand the men, it also led to an understanding and really researching how women express their emotions too, and the basic physiology of the brain, neurochemicals, neural pathways, why we do what we do. And there were just so many moments that opened up my eyes to who we are as a, if you'll forgive me, who we are as a species and why we act the way that we do. And that's been a phenomenal ride. And that's where I am now. And it's wonderful. And it's a great healing thing.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for the research that you've done.
Oh.
As you've talked about some of these aha moments and these awarenesses. So what are some of these that you can share with us about this nature versus nurture? What is that?
Well, and of course, nature refers to the fact of who we are biologically, how we were created through our DNA. And really, it takes some time, and we'll probably talk about it, but to take some time, we were actually over centuries developed to be exactly the way that we are right now, and predominantly for a survival reason, for survival of the species. Depending on where I talk, of course, I mean, it depends on whether or not you believe in God or you believe in Darwinism, but they're kind of the same thing. It's survival of the species. And everything that we've learned as a species has always been about survival. How are we going to survive? And our genes have picked that up along the way. And then when we get out of that nature topic, we get into nurture, then we talk about after the womb, after we've been born, and how our role models take an impact on affecting who we're going to be. And that could be anywhere from, of course, your parents to your Boy Scout troop leader, to your coaches, to your school teachers, to a number of things. They all have a certain impact on what develops us and what our belief systems are, even subconsciously, for the most part consciously, but even subconsciously. So those two issues really drive who we are as a person, and sets us on a path where there are quite a bit of similarities in between the sexes, but there are so many dynamic differences in us that we have to realize that we are two different sexes. We do it two different ways. We live life purposely for two different ways.
And so what are some of these differences?
Well, we can go back to the fact that, number one, women will bear a child and men will not. Now, if we go back to the nature part of it, and we go back to the day that we climbed out of the primordial ooze, or we came from the Garden of Eden, women were tasked with giving birth to a child. And during that time, they're frail. They need protection. Of course, their body is undergoing all that. And the male was the one that gave them protection. As we move along the way, that hasn't changed a bit. No matter what we've done as far as becoming equal as sexes in the world, where we've got equal pay and equal voting rights, and everybody deserves the same respect, and they do, that fundamental role has never changed. And there are some things that go along with that. The other part of that came through the DNA is that whole chemical wash that we've got in our brain. You've got all the hormones that bounce around in there, everything that drives us to react in certain ways subconsciously, because those things, just when a certain instant comes up and we respond to it because a certain chemical hit our brain in a certain way, that's a subconscious reaction, and it happens instantly. And it's so hard to have a conscious ability to stop that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We almost have to respond to it because our body's been programmed to respond in a fight or flight, or in so many other fashions. And it's so different. We're not even into the difference in between some of the structural differences, the biological differences in the male and female brain. Just the chemicals alone drive us to do a number of things that are fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, and before we get in, because I would like to touch base a little bit on what those actual biological differences are in our brain that causes us to react differently.
Right.
But what is grief, and what is happening to us when we're in that process?
Well, grief is, and this is a good thing. This is the second topic that I had with the grief case, and I call grief just a container word. And we hear it all the time, and you and I will use it a dozen times a day without even questioning it. And it's the right word to use for us, but grief is not an emotion. Grief is a container word for all the emotions that are inside. So when I lost Jonathan, if somebody were to ask me how I felt at the time, I would not have said, I feel grieved. I would have said, I feel angry. I feel confused. I feel frustrated. I feel scared. I feel a number of different emotions, which are all contained within what you and I use as that word grief. So it's that bundle of emotions that come, and it's the right time to say, for anybody that doesn't know this, and hopefully by now everybody does, that there are not 5 stages of grief and a loss. The 5 stages of grief that Kubler-Ross came up with for palliative care, people who were terminal and going to die. You and I probably went through 5 stages of grief in 5 minutes after we experienced our loss. There is no timeline. There is no set number of times you're going to experience this part of grief, that part of grief, that part of grief, this emotion, that emotion, that emotion.
And it's unique to us individually, not just as men versus women either, correct?
No, not at all. I call it snowflakes and fingerprints. We're all very unique, and we fit on a broad spectrum of species. We could have experienced the same loss. You and I could be twin brothers, and we could have experienced the same type of loss, and we're going to go through it differently because there are different parts of different nurturing, different nature parts of us that are going to react in a certain way. There are enough generalities, and people ask all the time, can you really speak in this general? It's a broad brush topic, but I think there's enough of us that are fitting in that generality. And I use the example that we all know that men are generally taller than women, but we all know women that are taller than men. And it's the same thing. Generally, we all sort of fit into the spectrum of masculinity and femininity.
So maybe this is a good time to go into some of those biological differences when we think about grief and how we might experience them differently as men and women in those general terms. Mm-hmm. Would you share a little bit about some of those fundamental biological differences?
I like to do the fun ones, and the fun ones really start out with the size portions of some of the parts of the brain, like the amygdala. And if you study the amygdala, you'll find out that it's responsible for sex drive. It's responsible for fight or flight. It's responsible for emotions. And a male's amygdala is twice the size of a female's in the brain. There's controversy about that, but most people will agree that the amygdala is larger in a male than it is a female. So if you go to that fight or flight process, it's within that part of the brain, because it's larger in a male will tend to respond to a fight or flight by either running or basically getting into some kind of aggressive action, whether that's arguing, whether that's physical or what have you. Whereas the smaller amygdala of the female will allow her to speak about it more than take a physical action. So that shows a difference right there. When it comes to the emotional part, studies have shown, and most people don't realize this, studies have shown that men are actually twice as emotional as females. However, men express those emotions more internally, females more externally. But it's also interesting to find out that in between the ages of being a toddler and about 7 or 8, if you watch young males will emote emotions much more than a young female will. Then around the 7 or 8 years of age, they start to look around at their male role models and realize that nurture comes into play, and big boys don't cry and all the other things, which will retard some of that. But you've got the emotions in there. The male is twice as emotion. And you've got the sex drive. And the sex drive, we all know that men are more promiscuous than women when it comes to sex. So that has a driving factor more so on men than it does on women. The fun side of that is you can look at the hippocampus, which is larger in the woman than the man. And the hippocampus is a primary memory center. And it's responsible for establishing basically what memories really get locked into that higher ability to pull back and remember them. And I like to say that, if we as men had a hippocampus the size of a mobile home, a woman has a double wide mobile home full of memories, which allows her a lot of times to come back into a conversation that we completed 6 months ago and start it right back up. And we're going, I have no idea what you're talking about. So there are differences like that. And the one we talk about where women are much more prone after a loss to spend more time over memories and thinking about the lost loved one, where the male is doing what a male is supposed to do in his mind. He's action oriented. He's basically an organizer and a systemizer, and he's doing and doing and doing. A woman spends a lot of time with that larger memory center in her brain, almost looping back all the good times in life and becoming sad over that they will no longer happen. Now we see that quite a bit. So that's just a couple examples of how the physiology of the brain differs.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to me. And I think some of the things, so you mentioned, I just want to clarify a point because I think I might be confused on it, is so overall, so men feel more often or more deeply? I feel like I've heard a couple of different pieces, maybe not in our discussion, but through some of my research. And so I just was curious, is there a generality in that sense? Is it that men feel more often, more frequently, or that they actually feel deeper?
More often, more frequently, where it allows it to affect us. I mean, in some ways, men can be moody. We all know that. Sometimes we get moody and go hide in our cave. But I don't want to say that we feel them more deeply. We just feel them more often. We just do not express them on an outward way that a female will do.
Now, given those differences, for me, there's so many aha moments in that, in my readings of your books and your white paper and some of the other research that I've done. Just it provided for me and is providing for me an awareness, an understanding that allows me to relax a little bit in relationship with my friends, with my father, with my brother, and just to have that little bit of understanding. Do you find that to be the case when working with men and women?
Oh, I do. And it's there's not much joy we can take about what we've been through other than the fact that we get to meet with other men and women out there that are going through something. And when they come up and tell me that something I said really resonated with them, and now they understand. I was blessed early on with this after I put out my first book with a lady that called me from Wisconsin. And I put my phone number at the back of the book, and everybody is free to call me. And I love getting phone calls from people. But she said that she's been married 20 years past when they lost their child, and it was their only child. And she had almost divorced her husband 5 times because she just did not understand him. And because of my book, she now understood exactly what he was going through. There is no greater feeling than to realize that once you, and this isn't so much a pump about the book, mind you, it is about the knowledge, the awareness, the understanding, the aha moment that you got where you went, you know what, it doesn't mean I'm right or wrong. It just means that I understand now. And the best thing about getting together with grieving parents is, everybody as a grieving parent hears that whisper in their ear that you're probably going to get divorced, which is a huge fallacy. And I can give you the data on that. But, to be able to get with them and tell them, now that you have the knowledge and the awareness and the understanding, if nothing else, half your battle is gone right there. Just the awareness of what your spouse is going through and that he or she is okay and that you're okay.
And I think that's such a wonderful permission in a way, is just knowing that they're okay.
Right.
And I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, the challenge I think then becomes, well, how then do you come together? And, and it may not just be the loss of a child, as we were talking earlier. It could be the loss of a parent, or it could be, or it could be a dynamic between, a father-daughter relationship, or, so how can
mother-son?
Absolutely.
It could be.
Absolutely.
The easiest thing, and your question was what? I forgot again. I'm sorry.
I think basically what are some of the ways that we can come together? So once we have this understanding, this awareness that, okay, he's going to process it in this way and he's okay. And I'm okay. So then how can we work together when that time is right? And at what time?
Well, the biggest way I think is part of that awareness, which is going to say, they're doing this because this is the way they are. And I say it that way, and you have to take out of what I'm about to say and kind of solve that part of it, which is if you and I lost a child, and I'm looking at you and you're always crying, because that might be your feminine side that's always crying. And it could be a male who's always crying and a female who's not. We've talked about how sometimes they're just flipped around. But you're looking at me and I'm not crying. And sometimes in your mind, you're thinking, did he love the child as much as I originally thought? Because he's not responding in the way that I am. So therefore, when we get this awareness, when we get this understanding that that's not who they're wired to be, that's not who they were raised to be through both nature and nurture, then you realize the love was there. And that's some of our biggest fears is somebody thinking that I didn't love the child as much as anything. That really was one of my triggers to really get started in the researching thing, is because I had a number of people, close people within my immediate family, who said, why aren't you crying the way that the others are? Did you not love your child as much as the others? And at that point, I went after this thing of, why am I not crying? Am I wrong? Is there something wrong with me? And the aha moment was, I'm okay. Right?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And as I've said so many times, this isn't about changing anybody. It's about realizing this is who you are.
Yes. And so once you have that realization and that understanding of who you how are there ways to communicate in an effective way with, say, your partner who maybe doesn't completely understand that you're okay, or maybe with somebody in the workplace, when, because we have to, or at least in our world, the majority of the time, we're expected to continue to move forward.
Sure, and interact. And we have to go forward with a face that looks like that we're moving forward so that they think that we're okay and we can do the job. Going back to spousal relationships or just a partner relationship or even father-daughter, it does come down, and you said, is there a way to communicate? It is communication in whatever way that you can get it. I alluded to the stats that go with the divorce rates or, after the loss of a child. And you can kind of pair that around the fact that divorce rates usually about 50% for first-time marriages and stuff. But after you get through that, you can pare it down and find out that even through the CDC, it'll show you that only 13% of the parents that lost a child end up in divorce. And of that 13%, some of them, the majority of them, were found to have underlying marital relationship issues before the loss of the child and probably would have divorced regardless. But then if you've got that small a number that are divorcing after the loss of a child, that means there's already love there. There's already a strong connection in between the two. So hopefully communication is already there. If not, then I encourage to go out and find something to help you with the communication skills. Because if you can do that, if you can understand, I know why you are. I know why you are. I know why you're going through this. I know why you're reacting like that. It places so much of the burden off of that whole high stressor area.
Yes, I could. That sounds amazing to me.
But I'm cheating by you're going, is there a way to communicate? I'm going, communicate. Figure out how to communicate. Talk about it with each other.
Yes, but I think that is important. And I think that in a healthy relationship, there is going to be a way to communicate. Mm-hmm. I know that in my situation, it ended up falling away. The relationship ended up falling away, but maybe that was because there was other underlying things. And, I still don't know the answers to that. But it's been part of the journey and the process. And I'm really grateful for having the understanding and awareness that there are these differences between men and women, mm-hmm. and then how we can find ways to communicate. And
that was me, by the way. Sorry. No, I'm just kidding.
So I guess one of the things that my question, or where I was going, is that this is a potential way for having that awareness and understanding of the differences between men and women. You can actually deepen your relationship. Again, whether it's a spousal relationship or whether it's the relationship between a daughter and a father, or a mother and a son, or maybe a significant friend relationship. Do you find that to be the case in those that you work with?
It is, and it's hard to tell anybody that there are treasures or gifts that come out of this. But the way you were taking it right to this, so the relationship is actually going to be stronger when they survive something like this. If you take it on an individual level and go back to the old quote that says, "I've never met a good person who hasn't been through a bad past." Relationships that can survive this kind of thing, which are the majority of the relationships. I mean, relationships that can survive this are going to come out of it even stronger because you did lean on each other. You did understand each other. We talked before we went live just about how it transforms us individually in a transformational way that we would give back if we could, but we've gone through it and we can't give it back. A couple's going to go through it and would probably say, like I said to you before we started, which is I'd give it back in a heartbeat and go back to the way I was before, but I like who I am. And with a couple, when they've been through something like this greatest stressor, and they come out on the other end realizing I still have you and you still have me and thank you for supporting me, it's actually a stronger relationship. And that could be husband and wife. It could be father-daughter. It could be mother-son. It could be siblings, brother and sister.
Right.
That come out of it stronger.
So how, and I like the talking a little bit more about some of the expectations of being in the world and getting, the relationship of being back in the world and the relationship of being back in the workplace.
Mhm.
How are some ways that we can, I guess, as a man and as a woman, how can we honor what we're going through and our experience while still having to show up and be in the world? And maybe it's different for men and women in general.
It is, but only in the ways that there are different men and women. Women are going to be more emotional when they go back. Men are going to try to go back, and a lot of times it could lead to repressed grief, where a man's going to go back and try to use work as an excuse to kind of avoid the thought of grief. And that comes from a lot of issues. Like, in my case, I felt, I was out of control when I lost my child. And for a man to lose a control issue, I wanted to go back to work where I could control something. I know I can control things when I go back to work because I'm the boss. So I need to go back and control my life and control things. But, if you get beyond that and get into just returning to work and trying to survive on a day-by-day basis, you're going to go into an environment where, and you have to realize this, nobody comes at you with any malice in their heart. The first thing that we have to realize is, much like the day after we lost our child or the day of his service or her service, people said some pretty bad things, or not bad things, things that just you thought were just, bad to say. You can go buy a puppy, you can have another child, you can do this, do that. And I try to tell people, these are dear, sweet people that are just trained in their mind that when we're hurting, they're supposed to approach us and say something kind to us, but they have no idea what to say. And the strangest things pop out of their mouth. So just try to understand first, the people around you don't have malice in their heart. They're just not trained to deal with us. So when we go back to work, it is going to be difficult. When I do some of the workshops on grief in the workplace for businesses, I give them my example. I was a director in a company, and I love being a director. I was so great at that name. I just did what a director does. I just directed. That was my job. I just directed. I had 20 managers. And my day was like this. I got my cup of coffee and I sat down at my desk, and one by one, 20 managers would stop by my door and go, "Good morning, Ron, I'm doing this. Good morning, Ron, I'm doing this. Good morning, Ron, I'm doing this." And it might not be everybody's business model, but it worked well for me. Well, what happened when I returned to work after the loss of John?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody came by my door anymore. Nobody. And because they were uncomfortable with mortality, they were uncomfortable with what to say to me. So I had to do some adjusting and realize that myself. But, I had to go chase them down now. I had to spend the time chasing down 20 managers to find out what the status was, and then have meetings again. So everybody had to gather, so I knew what was going on. But they were uncomfortable, and you have to deal with other people's uncomfortableness in that. Their mortality is there, but for the grace of God go I. So if there was a coworker I had, or a peer or subordinate that had a live child, and they looked at me, the first thing they thought of was, "Oh my gosh, if that were me, I couldn't stand losing my child." And the mind actually goes, "I don't want to think about that." And the only way not to think about that is not to approach Ron. Make sense?
Yes.
So they will avoid you at work. They don't know what to say.
Well, yeah. Do you have any advice or insights so if a listener is maybe not experiencing grief themselves, but they know somebody close to them that is, and they would like to be there and be supportive of that person, but they don't know what to say?
Then don't say anything. Just be there. Just be there. Say hi, good morning. Make the day as normal as possible. Recognize the event. Don't try to offer this. Just, whatever I can do, let me know. Because, it's not going through our minds. We're not worried about that. Sometimes just seeing a coworker is enough. Don't cross the hallway. Don't avoid us when we're walking down the hallway, because we see you avoiding us. We know you're there. Realize that we're smiling and we're putting on a face that shows that we're moving forward, and inside we're not. Realize if you are working with somebody who's been through a traumatic loss, like a spouse or a child, there is no getting over it. You'll feel bad for us on that first day, but then you'll go home to a house that doesn't have grief in it. You'll wake up to a house that doesn't have grief in it. You'll go back to work and I'll still be grieving. But I'll be smiling and I'll be showing you that I'm okay. But I'm not.
Right. Very beautifully explained. It's very true. And it is hard. It's hard on both sides. It's hard to be the one that has had and experienced the loss. And it's also hard to be the coworker or the friend or, the family member of of somebody who, watching somebody go through it, because, and many of us, because we are, I think at the core of us all really is this love and compassion place, and we want to be there. And even though we can't necessarily relate or understand or know what the right thing to do is, I think oftentimes we want to fix it.
We do. Workplace is extra hazardous because everybody knows it, we spend more awake time at the workplace with the people we work with than we spend at home with our loved ones. So we take that as a place of safety a lot of times. And when we go back there, we're actually looking for safety, but now we find people avoiding us. So one of the things I try to teach business leaders is, without violating any HIPAA laws and trying to be as respectful as possible, one of the key things that I want them to do is kind of get the teams together and go over the loss story. Because what happens is you return to work and you've got 50 people that are going to approach you and ask you what happened. Tell me about it. And you're going to relive that trigger time after time after time after time when you go to work and retell that story. If we can get to the employers beforehand and let them know, hey, it's okay to go ahead and let everybody in a general sense know what happened, and please don't approach them and say, tell me about it. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think that's actually really a wonderful thing, and I think should be incorporated in more workplaces, and actually at a much larger cultural level. I feel like there's a lot of traditional cultures who do that sort of thing already. But I don't necessarily feel like we do that here.
We've lost mourning. We don't do mourning here anymore. I call it the where is everybody effect, where, and I love my family to death, and this is nothing derogatory towards my dear friends and family, but they were all here for days after I lost Jonathan. They were all here at the service, and Monday morning, it was just me, and everybody was gone. But it's a culture that we live in now because they have to get back to their jobs and they have to get back to their lives. We're no longer in that mourning period or allowed to be in that mourning period where there are people who are going to help take care of you. Everybody has to leave.
Right. Well, and given that there is sort of this, everybody's going to continue to move forward in their way. And there's, in a way, it kind of puts a timeline on our grief for us, right? And when there really isn't a timeline. I know in my case and in yours, I'll never get over it.
No.
It will always be a part of me, but I'm going to continue to move through it. And I'm going to continue to show up each day. And I am open and I am looking for this places to smile in life and to find the laughter and to find the joy and those different pieces and to share the good experiences that this life has for us.
To have peace and purpose.
That's right. That's right.
So I like to think if you're a believer in God, then God had a plan for your loved one. And if you're not with that loved one right now, it means your plan is not done. You've still got things to do here. You've still got a purpose on earth, and do it peacefully. Never move forward. And we've talked about moving forward, and we talked about it before we started. You're never going to move forward without your loved one. When we talk about moving forward, I want people to know right off the bat, you're not asking anyone to move forward without taking that lost loved one with them in the memory of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Because I know my daughter is a part of my life every day, and she will be.
Right. And we run into people that are new in their grief, and it's so hard to tell them that there will be a day, and I promise you, there will be a day where you'll want to shout their name out, and you'll want to talk about them, and you want other people to talk about them. It's not that prevalent in early grief because it still hurts so much. And everything is a trigger. So, but there will be a time, and look for that time that you want to shout their name from the mountains.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift just a little bit, but so I feel that through my experience, that there is really a big wounding in expectation on women and men. Albeit all different expectations,
right.
How men are going to show up in the world and how women are going to show up in the world. And you talked a little bit about this as we started the conversation today. But this added confusion or strain and talking about the societal expectations of mourning really doesn't exist. There really isn't an acceptance for it and a way for it to be supported. Does this add strain and confusion to the process of going through grief and loss,
Oh, sure.
and the responsibilities that we have on our shoulders as men and women?
Yes, absolutely. And for both sexes. And, you know, nothing is ever going to be equal for both sexes, but at the same time, there's so many similarities. We are, um, you know, we're in a world where everybody's got a business out there. And it's, I know we're going back to business. I hate just doing that, but you know, and I was an executive in a business. I get this. I mean, we're not nonprofit organizations. We're for-profit organizations, and you know, productivity is profit, and productivity is boots on the ground, and we need our people back. So therefore, we're driven back to work earlier. In this country, sadly, the average is 3 days of bereavement leave for a good company. Department of Labor does not regulate days off in any way, shape, or form for vacation, holidays, any of that. FMLA is the only thing that they even get involved with when it comes to time off. So, you know, a good company might say, listen, we'll give you 3 days of bereavement leave. We will give you maybe your unused vacation days that you've got, and then take the rest of the time off unpaid that you need. But how long can even a modest bank account survive without being filled in, you know, every 2 weeks? So we're going to have to go back to work, and that's got to drive us to probably go in before we're ready. Whether, like I said, with the males, it might lead to repressed grief, or whether it is a bank account issue, we're moving on somebody else's timeline. We're not in that mourning period anymore, and we're not allowed to be, because we have to move forward and move on somebody else's timeline. Gosh knows I've seen people that have been able to stay home that have been in bed literally for 6 months before they got up and healthfully moved forward. But it took them 6 months to get around to do it because they were so traumatized by the loss. So yeah, it hurts when you're living on somebody else's timeline.
Absolutely. And talking a little bit more about the societal expectations and the difference between men and women in the way that we take on these responsibilities. Mm-hmm. So for example, let's say there's, you know, you've been talking about in the more of a corporation sort of a workplace, but in a lot of ways, and there seems to be this new movement of self-employed people. And so somebody, let's say, that has their own business, we'll say a male, and he is responsible for, you know, making sure that the work comes in, taking care of the employees that he does have, but also the responsibility if he's in relationship, you know, being there for that partner, being there for themselves, for their self-care, and just all these different layers that can cause all sorts of grief.
and anxiety in a male, which the anxiety inside of you really is created by some of that. You do create anxiety. You know, and we could talk about interactions in between others, but in a relationship, a male gets quite a bit of anxiety because the female is actually crying. In a male's mind, everything that's modeled in his brain is he's supposed to protect his spouse. And she's crying and he can't stop that. And that creates a great bit of anxiety in him because he's supposed to be able to protect her. So now he goes back to, if he is a business owner, he's an entrepreneur, and he's out there running his own business, he does have that protection clause in him. He's got to protect everything. And there's so much just confusion going on inside of himself that there's so much anxiety built up. It is tough. I mean, it will impact somebody greatly.
Yeah. And what are some different ways, positive ways of coping in, you know, stressful situations like this?
Again, a lot of it comes down to self-understanding. Go get professional help if you need to get professional help. Realize that you're okay, and give yourself the time and space to do what you need to do. Grief, even early on, will have a tendency to come in waves. And we've seen that, you know, immediately after the traumatic loss, of course, that wave is just a giant wave that continues to crash down on you. But then, you know, after a while, if you'll allow me kind of the visualization, I say it's, you know, you're on a ship and you've charted your ship on nothing but calm seas. We do that. We want to do that. When we lay out our life before us, we always want to sail on calm seas. And then suddenly that wave comes, and that wave crashes down on the deck of the ship. And all you can do is just grab onto something and hold, because wave after wave after wave is crashing down on you. And you're lost. You don't know where to steer to. And then eventually, slowly over time, the waves get a little lower and they get a little farther apart. And you suffer through that for a while till finally you realize, I'm never going to stop the waves now. I've been blown off of that course. I'm never going to be able to get back on that course again. But now when I see the waves coming, I can hold on, and I can wait for that wave to crash over me, and I can go back again. So anytime you're in our position where you've got to go live your normal life, but you know the wave is going to come, you know the triggers that I'm talking about, the songs you hear on the radio that remind you, the birthdays that come up, the day of passing that comes up, they're going to come across a business owner or man or woman, and they're going to have to realize, here comes that wave. That wave is coming. What am I going to do? And when that wave washes over you and it's done, then go back to that life that you had before. Go back to realizing that, hey, I'm going to get another wave coming pretty soon, but I'll be ready for it.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
No, you're welcome.
So I'm wondering, are there other pieces that are coming up for you that you'd like to share with this audience in particular, about through the journey of going through grief and loss, and anything that you'd like to share?
I'd like to tell everybody that I am doing a book about me and you. I am doing a book about the people that have been through what we have and have discovered the fact that we want to continue to share that unconditional love. And when we reach out as advocates, and before I say anything else, all of this, and we talked about this, all of this helps us. All of this helps you and I. But there are so many like us that have been through this trauma that are out there day after day after day, reaching out a hand saying, I'm walking on this journey. Come with me. I'm a few steps ahead of you. So let me hold out my hand and pull you forward with me as much as I can. Let me give you some of that understanding. And the book that I'm writing speaks to that, and the great people I found along the way that are doing this advocacy for others. And most of the time, at their own expense. What people don't realize is much of what you and I do has no expense tied to it whatever. We give of our time because of that unconditional love that we felt for our child or our loved one, and we can't stop feeling that. So we have to reach out and try to give it to others, and this is how we do it. And the book is about why we do it. And it all comes down to the unconditional love part. But it also goes a little bit farther, and it discusses, and maybe this is important to people, that loss isn't the only grief out there. We all know a number of people now that are coming back out of the Army because the military doesn't need all they had before. And all of a sudden you were a 22-year-old career military guy, and now you're facing forced retirement. And I kind of, not to jump around, I kind of call it the blueprints of our life. We had a blueprint. You had a blueprint with your child. I had a blueprint with my child. He was 16. He was just discovering girls. Pretty soon there'd be a wife and a granddaughter or grandson for me. That was my blueprint. It was taken away. So if you get somebody that was forced out of the military, or somebody that's lost, unfortunately, a limb or a body part, and that changed them medically so much, unwanted divorce. There's so many things that might not equate to the type of loss you and I have, but impacts them at work, impacts them in their daily life as much as our loss did. And I want to add that in the book and find some of those people, and I have found, add some of those people that have gone through other traumatic events, but then talk about all of us and why we've come out this other end going, let me help, let me hold out my hand. Thank you for allowing me to talk about that.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you so much, because that's a lot of what inspired this piece for me and to share.
And thank you for doing it, by the way. Thank you for what you do.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. It really is. And I'm really, as you said before, I'd give it back in a heartbeat, but I am really honored to be here. And because there are so many losses, and I, throughout my life have experienced a number of them, in addition to, the loss of my daughter and everything that fell out of that situation. And I, we are human, and we are. And there are going to continue to be losses, even if it's just a way of life as we once knew it. And what you're talking about, I love the way that you describe that as a blueprint, and particularly in what you're talking about, the soldiers coming back, because life is different, And it's a loss that happened outside of your control. And that's the biggest thing. I mean, none of us would do this purposely, but the events that happened to us were outside of our control, and we love to control things. They took away our plans without our control. Now we've got to rewrite new plans, new blueprints about where we're going to go from here. And that's difficult when you're early in the grief. I've heard it say, and I don't know whether I agree so much with liking the term, the new normal. I mean, I've used it myself for several years now, but I'm not sure
I think just kind of getting the concept of the blueprint, and I'm redrawing my blueprints in a way that include my lost child. But, where am I moving forward to here?
Yeah. Yeah. And I like, it is hard to say, the new normal. And I've also heard, sort of that time referenced as, our relationship to our life, our relationship to grief, our relationship to our situation, our relationship to our story shifts. It changes, right?
Right.
With each day, with each experience, so thank you.
Oh, no, thank you.
And I do know that you have a very generous offering for our audience today.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, sure. For anyone that is involved in this, I'm going to offer any of the 3 books I have. Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, The Grief Case, and Grief Healing 365 is a free download from your website.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much.
I just hope someone can find something in that will help them move forward too.
Yes, and I have to. I'll let the audience know that when I first heard about Ron and we first connected, and I heard about his book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, I went immediately and I downloaded the book and I started to read it, and it really was an aha moment for me in so many ways. And so I encourage you all to explore his work. And if you'd like to find out more information about Ron and what he does in the world, you can visit his website at www.grievingmen.com. He also has a Facebook. He's on Facebook too at R. Glenn Kelly. And he is very open to you contacting him via email or on the phone. So if you have any questions or you feel called to connect with Ron, please do so. Is there anything else that you'd like me to add, or would you like to add in?
Closing statement from me is, especially for men who have a tendency to hold their feelings in. With grief comes a lot of anger, comes a lot of guilt. I'll go as far as to say most times it's false anger and it's false guilt. If you keep those inside, they start out consciously. They will move to your subconscious. And if they move to your subconscious, they're going to act on your conscious, or they're going to act on your behalf without your conscious control. And that's who you're going to become, is a angry, bitter person. The subconscious is what makes your heart beat 100,000 times a day and your lungs inflate and deflate 70,000 times a day. That anger will act on your behalf and not out of malice. It thinks it's supposed to. So let your feelings out. You don't have to show them to anybody. Go cry in the shower. Go scream in the car. Do whatever you have to, but do not hold them inside. And thank you for allowing me the time to say that.
Well, thank you for saying it. I really appreciate your time today, Ron, and for all the gifts that you're sharing with us and the world. And I look forward to continuing this friendship and connecting with you in the future. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon.